Our second reading is a letter from St. Paul to a slave owner. And it's a letter accompanying a runaway slave that St. Paul is sending back to this slave owner. Now, hearing that is scandalous, especially for us as Americans with our national history of slavery. And I've found that this undercuts our evangelical witness. That if I try to argue something morally from the Bible, sometimes people will come back at me with, well, the Bible endorses slavery, ergo QED, therefore nothing you say matters and you have to shut up. Okay. Well, if that's going to be the case, then we as Christians need to better understand slavery and slavery as it appears in the Bible. First, we really need to be careful with terms. So as Americans, when we hear slavery, we think specifically about the American experience of slavery. But let's define it more generally. Slavery generally has two components. Component number one is a lack of freedom of movement. A person cannot leave a household or an area or land. Using that definition, for example, some people have referred to medieval serfs as slaves because they were tied to specific land. I wouldn't use that definition, but because that's an aspect of slavery, others have. The other aspect of slavery is forced work. You are forced to do this, that, or the other thing. Part of the lack of freedom of movement is then accentuated by, okay, this is what you have to do. And there's a third component that has not always been true or is true in different ways in different eras, but it's dehumanization. The dehumanization is very obvious in the American context. The way in which that was done was particularly egregious and terrible. But in the ancient world, it was a little bit different. The ancient world didn't have racial categories, nor did they have racial slavery. Basically, they just had categories of strong and weak. If your country was conquered because you were a weak country, then you deserve to be a slave. That was Aristotle's formulation, that slavery comes from the strong and the weak are brought into slavery because of their weakness. That's a form of dehumanization, but it's different than the American form, which is why I call it out. Now, again, because of our American experience of slavery, our tendency is to say all slavery everywhere in every form in both categories is always wrong, always. But I would offer you two examples that sort of challenge that. The first is prisoners. If somebody is in prison, and as part of their imprisonment, they are required to do certain work, again, that forced labor component, most of us do not have a moral objection to that. They're in prison. They need to try to assist society in some way, shape, or form, or, work for the prison, do tasks around the prison, have chores. In lower security prisons, you might have chores. None of us really object to that. And yet, there is no freedom of movement. That person is not allowed to leave their facility. And there is forced labor. I'd also say something similar with prisoners of war. A prisoner of war, trying to destroy your country, captured in war, now held in a prison, forced to do some kind of labor to assist the war effort. Most of us don't have a moral objection to that. Always with the exception in both cases that that person be treated like a human being, that they be given food and shelter, that they not be subjected to the capricious whims of the labor overseer, right? That they not be beaten. All of the things that kind of come in the Geneva Convention, for example, about prisoners of war. And so there's a trouble there. There's a trouble with saying slavery is always wrong everywhere. We have to get deeper into why is slavery wrong? What are the conditions under which we would say this is morally unallowable? The Catechism, I think, has a very helpful definition there. This is Catechism number 2414. It says, "The seventh commandment forbids acts or enterprises that for any reason, selfish or ideological, commercial or totalitarian, lead to the enslavement of human beings, to their being bought, sold, and exchanged like merchandise, in disregard for their personal dignity. It is a sin against the dignity of persons and their fundamental rights to reduce them by violence to their productive value or to a source of profit. St. Paul directed a Christian master to treat his Christian slave no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother, both in the flesh and in the Lord. What the Catechism recognizes is that the immorality of slavery is specifically rooted in the dehumanization portion of slavery. Nothing in this world can ever justify treating a human being as anything other than a human being. The American experience, for example, the term that's used is chattel slavery. I had to look up the word chattel, not a word that I learned in school. Chattel is an old legal term referring to goods, basically things that can be bought or sold or owned, things that you would have at your home, in your garage, or on a shelf. The idea that we would ever reduce a person to chattel is deeply immoral and wrong, and that is the source of immorality. However, that freedom portion, the Church, if you paid attention there, doesn't call that portion out. There are reasons in which somebody might give up their freedom, in which they might be giving up their freedom by committing crimes, giving up their freedom by committing war, or in the ancient world, and this one's a little more dicey, but in the ancient world they would give up their freedom through something called debt slavery. They would sometimes sell themselves into slavery to get out of debt, sometimes for a period of time, sometimes indefinitely. Those are harder. We humans, being broken and sinful, often can't be trusted with those. For example, 20 years after Columbus arrived in the New World, the Spanish crown, it was still Ferdinand and Isabella, outlawed slavery. Indians, Native Americans, were being made slaves. 1512, they said, you are not allowed to do that. You have to stop making Indian slaves. That is not in accord with their human dignity. But they left an exception for prisoners of war. If somebody is warring against you, you are allowed to capture them and you're allowed to force them to work. And so then the conquistadors said, oh look, here's a very flimsy excuse for war. Oh look, let's start a war, because they wanted more slaves and they used that loophole. Humans can't really be trusted with these things, which is why in general today we would say slavery is wrong. But again, with the moral categories, we have to be careful if we want to understand slavery in the Bible and where it comes up. So let's get to slavery in the Bible. It appears in the Old Testament in the form of slave laws. If you read through Leviticus especially, but Exodus and Deuteronomy, the law books, you will see laws about slaves. And again, opponents of Christianity will say, well, this means that the Bible is a terrible book, it's completely immoral, you can't listen to it. But they don't understand where these laws come from. In almost every case, laws in the Old Testament are God progressively bringing humanity to a better place. The Jewish law looks a lot like God seeing humanity in our brokenness and all of the things we do wrong and saying, okay, let's start to make this better. Now, God knows our hearts and knows that we are like obstinate teenagers, and when He tells us to do something, we often say, now I don't want to do it anymore. And so He slowly brought humanity to the point where we could receive the fullness of revelation in Christ. An example there would be divorce. Jesus is asked about divorce. Jesus says, and He's asked specifically, well, why would Moses give us divorce? And Jesus says, Moses gave you divorce because of the hardness of your hearts, but from the beginning it was not so. Which is, again, the idea that it's not supposed to be this way, but because humans are a mess, God gave us something that was progressive toward the fullness in Jesus. With slavery, what we see in the Jewish slave laws is a humanization of an institution that was universal across the world. Laws that required slaves be treated like human beings. Laws that required justice for slaves. Justice that said you can't just do violence against somebody because you want to. There has to be a crime committed, and the punishment has to be proportional to the crime. And the Jewish law even went further to get rid of permanent slavery. There were Jubilee years in which you had to free all slaves, and extended Jubilee years where if somebody had sold themselves into debt slavery and in the course of that had sold their family land, that every 50 years you had to give the land back to them. So there was no such thing as permanent economic slavery. Again, imperfect, sure, but progressive, humanizing, trying to do what the Catechism talks about, which is giving us no excuse ever to treat a human being as though they are not a human being, and trying to create humanizing laws around an institution that was pervasive everywhere in the ancient world. Then you get to the New Testament. And the New Testament is interesting because it is Jesus and the apostles seem to be fiercely apolitical. When the Pharisees try to get Jesus to comment on a political question, he dodges very adeptly. The most obvious being, should we be paying taxes to Caesar? And he says, okay, give me the coin, whose image is on it, give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God's. Jesus doesn't answer the question about Roman occupation, which is what they were asking about. That was the biggest question on the mind of the Jews at the time. There were entire political parties in Jesus' time oriented toward doing violence against Roman oppression. Jesus has nothing to say on the topic at all. But he has a lot to say on personal morality. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Or, if you do not hate father and mother, child, brother and sister, you cannot follow me. Which is to say, if you do not love God more than you love even the closest people in your life, you can't follow him. He had some deep and powerful things to say about how we should act, but he really didn't talk about political questions. St. Paul continues that. St. Paul and all of the New Testament writers don't really speak about the political questions of the time. They speak about what individual Christians are supposed to do, how they're supposed to live and treat other people. In fact, the only real political writing we have in the New Testament comes from the first letter of St. Peter, where he tells them to pray for the emperor. Now, this is the same emperor that ended up killing St. Peter, so that statement means a lot coming from him. So how do we understand our second reading, St. Paul's letter to Philemon? Well, a couple things help us understand it. First, slavery in the Roman Empire was not slavery in the United States. Slavery in the United States, I think, is the worst and ugliest form of slavery this world has ever seen, because it was so oriented toward the dehumanization of African Americans, absolutely oriented toward not treating them as people. We had laws against educating slaves because we knew that that would humanize them. We had truly laws against treating them humanely in so many ways. In the Roman world, it was a little different. There were dehumanizing forms of slavery. Slaves in the mines did not have a good life. But there were also many, many slaves in the Roman world who were highly educated. They were members of the family, but really what slavery meant for these folks was you can't leave this household, but in every other way you are humanized, you are educated, you are treated very well. A lot of slaves were given very high posts in the Roman government. And by the second or third generation, there was generational slavery, which of course the church would say is wrong because you can't take somebody's freedom away if they're innocent. But there was generational slavery, but a lot of times the second or third generation was educated, was treated as a member of the household, and was very commonly given freedom. They could buy their own freedom because they were given a just wage. And a lot of free men in the Roman world, and there were a lot of them, ended up going to very high positions in the Roman government as well. So we don't know the situation of Philemon or Onesimus. We don't know who Onesimus was, we don't know what his status was, and we don't know who Philemon was. All we have to do is trust St. Paul, that he knew what he was doing, that somehow both of these Christians were not going to be able to love Jesus unless they reconciled, that Onesimus needed to go back to Philemon and find some kind of reconciliation. We have to trust that St. Paul was not sending Onesimus back into a dehumanizing situation, which we would say is always and everywhere wrong. We have to trust that St. Paul was not sending Onesimus back to be killed, although I'm sure it was not a comfortable thing, and this was Onesimus' moment where he had to say, okay, when I chose Christ, did I evaluate whether I had enough to build my tower? Did I evaluate whether my army was big enough? Did I say, I have enough to follow Christ, even into this incredibly difficult situation into which St. Paul sent him? We have to trust that somehow Onesimus was part of the Roman system that was not dehumanizing. Otherwise, our enemies' arguments against the Bible would be very valid. The other thing we have to recognize is that St. Paul's words here do undercut the institution of slavery. They absolutely undercut it. But as Americans today, we judge St. Paul for it. We believe that virtuous people are activists. That's what we look at in society today. Somebody has to yell at the politicians. They have to yell at power. They have to say all of these people are wrong, even if they have no control over it. Right? We want somebody to yell against Joe Biden or Donald Trump, even if they have no power over those men. And so we condemn St. Paul because he didn't start the letter by saying, this is a terrible institution, you should burn down the Roman Empire, the emperor is going straight to hell. Instead, St. Paul figures out, what do I have control over? And he says, don't treat this guy like a slave anymore. Stop it. Treat him like a brother. Treat him like you would me. St. Paul, instead of going after the political question, the virtue signal, he instead goes after this is how you're supposed to act as a Christian. You are both Christians, which means that you are brothers in Christ, which means regardless of the political institution, regardless of the legal situation that we find ourselves in, you must treat him as a brother. You must treat him as a human being, and not just a human being, as a member of the body of Christ. And St. Paul elevates that to, you must treat him as you would treat me. Philemon accepted Christianity at the hands of St. Paul, as best as we can tell. Philemon would have seen St. Paul as his spiritual father. And so to receive Onesimus as a spiritual father is quite the demand. I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong for us to look at this letter and say, because St. Paul didn't speak on the political question, everything in St. Paul and everything in the Bible is incorrect and immoral. I think it's better for us to say, St. Paul is actually much smarter than we are today. He was deeply concerned about the people in front of him. A final point, and I'll bring it to a close. On this, I also think about Pope Pius XII, often condemned because he didn't spend every breath of his pontificate condemning Hitler by name. But Pius XII was the genius behind the letter that was smuggled into Germany, and read from every pulpit condemning Nazism before it was fully in power. Pius XII personally was responsible for saving tens of thousands of Jewish lives by hiding them in different Vatican institutions. And yet we condemn him because he wasn't a political activist, because he just put his head down and did the work of loving people and saving their lives. And somehow that makes him evil. I'd say the same thing about St. Paul and the early Christian approach to slavery. They did a lot to free slaves. Early Christians bought the freedom of so many slaves in their congregations. But early Christians were generally apolitical. They prayed for the emperor, they put their head down, and they just did the work of loving the people in front of them. And I would encourage the same for us today. Regardless of what you think the forms of injustice are in this world, and I know a lot of us see injustice in different places, the most powerful thing you can do is love the person directly in front of you. The most powerful thing you can do is put your head down and do the work to do justice for the person that is in your life, that is in your community, that is right here with you. Yes, in a democracy, we have more political power than most people in the history of the world, and in a democracy, we should take our right to vote very seriously, and we should vote in a way that is just and moral. But change happens locally. Change happens personally. Pick somebody today that you are going to love as a Christian, as a brother, as a sister. Love that person and watch the ripples of justice go forth.